Well, after 2 days of delay, I guess actually 3 days of delay, while Lori-Vallow Daybell battled illness, we finally have a jury in her final conspiracy to commit murder trial. So Erica is here with us. She was
Andrea.
inside the courtroom. So we made it. Today it happened.
It did happen. There was, we weren't exactly sure what to expect when we showed up at court today, but it ultimately went through, and you could tell that Judge Justin Bareski is, on a mission to get that jury seated today. And ultimately, that is what happened. And we'll walk you through that whole process and all that transpired because, as you indicated, Andrea, Lori-Vallow Daybell, this wasn't a simple process, and she tried to delay it yet again today. But again, we have a jury. People are here. They're expected to show up tomorrow for the opening statements, and we're going to get this show on the road, as they say. But just to remind folks that we are on Lori-Vallow Daybell's third trial in under 3 years. Her first case in Idaho, she was found guilty of killing her children, Tylee and JJ, as well as her role in the death of her current husband, Chad Daybell's first wife, Tammy. Then, just back in April, she was on trial for the first time in Arizona for a conspiracy to murder her former husband, Charles Vallow. She was found guilty in that case, has not yet been sentenced. So we are moving into her third trial, which is another murder conspiracy case. And in this instance, she is being charged with conspiring to kill her niece's ex-husband, who did not die, but there was a shooting attempt at him. Investigators believe it was Lori's brother, Alex Cox, a name we've heard many, many times before. He died before charges were filed in this case. So he is not involved in the court process. He was never charged, but is widely believed by investigators to be the co-conspirator here. So that's the scene for us, Andrea. But yeah, it was certainly an interesting day in court. And, no one likes delays when you got to have a strict schedule to, stay on top of.
Yeah. So she had said, I know she was in court last week and then again on Monday and just said, I simply cannot go on. It is too much. So today you said she tried to delay again. So is she still saying she is still not feeling well?
Yes. So she came into the courtroom and we actually got video. We'll show you in just a moment. She was able to walk into the courtroom this morning. That's different. I point that out because she was wheeled in by a deputy on Monday using an MCSO wheelchair. And that was going to be a problem because, the judge said she did, the judge indicated he didn't want to have her seated that way in front of a jury that could maybe, indicate to them that she's in custody or something like that when you have MCSO written on the back of the chair. And she, at that time on Monday, said she simply couldn't get out of the chair to get into a regular chair. So we see her walk into the courtroom. It's almost like a stagger, it looks like. And, when she first addresses the court, she sounds sick. She's, upset that maybe there's some medical information that might be shared. So she's asking the judge, can you seal this? And then the sheriff's office actually had some sort of representative in the courtroom today to speak to, what has been done over the past 2 days since the judge said, okay, we're going to postpone this until Wednesday. And it sounded like she had been evaluated and, was given the green light to move forward, although that's not exactly what she wanted to do. So we want to bring you guys inside the courtroom what we saw today and take a listen for yourselves.
After court on Monday, immediately after court, I ordered the sheriff's office to provide some sort of medical assessment of the defendant. I received a pleading late yesterday afternoon indicating that Correctional Health Services examined the defendant around 12:30 p.m. yesterday. The defendant was treated for one condition, and Correctional Health Services has indicated that from a medical standpoint, we do not find any clinical indications to miss court. Is that correct, Mr. Vigil?
Yes, Your Honor, and we have additional information if you need it, but it's not much. But
all right. All right, let me turn to the defendant.
This is probably going to be a HIPAA violation coming up here.
Your Honor, first of all, can all of this be sealed? Anything that having to do with my medical? I don't think that's something that all of this needs to be sealed, including the minute entry and
hold on,
the response from MCSO, all these things.
I can seal the response from MCSO, yeah, but to the extent, well, do you have any other information you want to provide me as to why you're not medically able to proceed? Right now, the only objective information I have is that, you were assessed, and CHS sees no clinical indications of why you need to miss court.
They told me
If it's
that
something you want to discuss on sidebar, we can do that.
that would be great.
The court finds that the court has not been provided any objective medical information of why the defendant can't proceed today. Although the defendant expressed that she has a headache and is not able to proceed, she was able to fully advocate on her own behalf and articulate to me the reasons why she doesn't think she can proceed, and seems to be of sound mind and ability to proceed.
Now, was that her putting her head down on the, is her head down there like she isn't capable of sitting up? Is that what that was?
Well, yes, her head was down, Andrea. We can confirm that. The video shows it very clearly. We don't know why it was down. Maybe
Okay.
she knew this was coming because there was a sidebar in between those two moments. And sidebars, for those of us, watching here, is when, essentially the judge and the prosecutor and the defense have a private conversation that we can't hear. It's actually a crackly sound going on inside the courtroom. So they spoke for a few minutes, and it seemed that she knew before the judge issued this decision to the court that she had to move forward today. So maybe it was putting her head down in defeat. Maybe she's still feeling ill. The judge had indicated that she said she had a headache. But yeah, her demeanor is very interesting. I know it's something we've talked about before, Andrea, but once we got the show on the road and the possible jurors came in, and we'll walk everyone through that process. But I want to point out a key moment that, again, we had no cameras for the jury selection process. So there were some things that happened that I think are, important to point out. And the judge felt it was very important to point out that while the jury was present and Vallow Daybell was able to ask them certain questions about maybe biases or things like that, anything she wants to ask to try and rule out who might not be a good juror for this case, she was very talkative. She was chipper. She, exerted her voice. And then as soon as the possible jurors left, she was very, very soft-spoken, even hard to hear from our vantage point behind, in the back of the courtroom. And then at some points, she didn't appear to respond to the judge. So he made it a point to put on the record that he said, I think it's interesting that, you can talk when the jury's here, but you can't when they're not. So again, not directly saying that something's up here, but he just wanted to make that point. And, throughout all of these delays, it's been, it almost feels like walking on eggshells a little bit because, again, he asked for that proof beyond her own, self describing her as sick. And that was just not a third party saying she couldn't come to court. And that was just not something that happened in her favor today. So certainly interesting demeanor. What did you think, Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, it is, you could argue that that's what she's supposed to do. She's supposed to be, not giving any sign of weakness or any kind of change of demeanor. I guess she's supposed to be putting her best self forward in front of the jury. So one could argue that's exactly what she was doing, much like you or I have to kind of turn it on or be our best, even when we're not feeling well, if we have to get through a show or through, some sort of presentation. We've surely done that at some point. So maybe that's what she was doing. But I think to his point, he's also has made that very clear. It felt to him, it seems, that she was perhaps being a little more theatrical or a little more exaggerated than maybe necessary. And so I think it's interesting that he put that on the record just in case that were to come up. I'm sure that that's, putting that out there. So in case that comes up later, that she was forced to work through some sort of, significant illness, if that's what she argues, this kind of goes, I think probably just helps to say, well, you seem to be functioning just fine as you need to. So, putting that out there as it doesn't seem that you are, incapacitated and unable to proceed. So just furthering his opinion that, yes, this needs to keep happening or this needs to move forward. And that's exactly what it is doing. So let's explain a little bit about that process, because it is very important for the court to protect the jurors in any case. And of course, these are potential jurors. Even the ones who don't get selected, that is something the court takes very seriously in terms of they don't allow us to show the jurors during the trial. We don't get to see who they are. We don't get to know their names or anything about them. And so that's why we aren't able to share with our viewers any of that information. We aren't allowed to have cameras in there, but yet you are allowed to sit in and listen. So what were some of those things that both sides were concerned about? What were they asking? What were they questioning these potential jurors about?
So walking through, Andrea, we start with the judge, who kind of asks some more general questions about, what's your experience been like with courts? Have you ever been involved in a process like this before? Not that would necessarily rule someone out, but, if they, for example, someone disclosed that, I served on a criminal trial back in 2018, as it was interesting because more people than maybe 4 or 5 people indicated that they actually served on a jury before. And I'm like, interesting odds to be called again, because I've never been summoned to serve in that way, especially not multiple times. So it's interesting. But there was, for example, as I said, that one woman said she was on a criminal trial in 2018. The judge followed up by saying, like, well, were you a foreperson? What was the verdict? What was the case? I think trying to rule out if there's any way someone could be biased about a similar charge or something like that. And there was a person earlier in the day who indicated that he had gone through, a court situation himself. He felt like he wasn't treated fairly, and he maybe would have some resentment towards a court system because of that. And that that possible juror was ultimately excused. So just things like that weeding out. And then we have both sides. So the prosecutor can also ask their own set of questions. And in this case, there was, it was pretty run of the mill, I would say. But maybe the one more interesting question that stood out was, Prosecutor Trina Kay said, I only asked this because of the political climate we're in now, but do any of you have biases against Tesla? Because the alleged victim in this case, he was driving a Tesla at the time of this alleged shooting. This is back in 2019, October. So no one indicated that they had a problem with that, but it's interesting how, how you have to be thinking, from all angles here. And the prosecutor also pointed out, and I'm not sure if she would have asked this had things started on time like they were supposed to, but she told the jurors, we will be presenting witnesses to you in a non-chronological order. We later learned, outside the presence of the jury, that she had to reschedule most of her out-of-town witnesses for next week. It's unclear if she wanted to maybe move some people around, but the possible jurors all indicated that they would be able to follow along, even if someone was maybe introduced before someone else was introduced. That would make more sense. So, really looking at the holistic picture here. And when it came to Lori-Vallow Daybell, and I want to get your take on one thing that happened here, but she, again, was able to ask questions. She sat down while doing it. So she indicated to the judge before the possible jurors came in that she couldn't stand. So she did, and the judge said, you can present however you want to. So she remained seated in her chair. And I'll point out that the state was also instructed to do the same, I think, maybe to, again, eliminate any sort of bias or any sort of indication that, okay, this prosecutor standing, moving closer to us, Vallow Daybell can't do that or is unable to do that at this time, says she can't do it. So, just little things like that. Again, everyone being super careful. But Vallow Daybell asked, some interesting questions saying, would anything happening in your home life prohibit you from concentrating on your duties as, possible jurors? She asked a lot of questions about guns, whether anyone owned a firearm. A handful of people raised their hands. She asked if anyone has ever been to a shooting range, and a majority of the possible jurors raised their hands. She didn't really follow up on some of those, but she did later ask jurors, or the possible jurors, can you, do you have expert knowledge on firearms? And, she followed up on a few that raised their hands, showing their number. And the state actually issued an objection here. She said, will this knowledge help you or harm you in this case? And the state said, I object. And, the judge was like, yeah, that's a pretty broad, kind of confusing question. Can you rephrase? So I'm curious what you think about an objection during jury selection.
Yeah. I mean, but I think that's probably to be expected, just because she simply doesn't know the law and has not studied the law in the way that an attorney has, of course. And we saw a lot of that, even remember in her last conspiracy to commit murder trial, we saw objections during opening statements. And that's very, very unusual to see in a case. So not surprising too much, but also interesting in that I wonder what she was trying to get at, and so probably there was a way to her question. And those are the things I always wonder in terms of her advisory council that's there. We know that she has these public defenders that would have been her would have represented her in court had she chosen not to represent herself. And so I'm always wondering how much guidance they give, and how much of that guidance that they may give does she follow? Do they go over the questions? Do they go through and ask, do I say this? Do I ask this? Or is it more if something comes up in the middle of court that she has a question about, they answer? We just don't know that. We don't know how much input they have. But I've always wondered, how much could they have avoided, or could they help her avoid these things?
Yeah. And we see them sitting there, and it's, they aren't just, they're paying attention as well. And they do talk with her. Sure. There are many moments where we see her conferring with her two advisory counsels. Again, these would be her public defenders had she gone that route, but she has a right to represent herself. That's what she's doing in this case. And that's why she's the one who's asking these questions of jurors and wants to be the one who's present for this. And, that illness or whatever she was dealing with earlier in this week, last week, that she said, was a problem for her, she really wanted to be the one to be doing this. And I think that's ultimately why the judge agreed to these delays. But, going into where we ultimately landed, the court is looking for 16 jurors. They excused a few people early on, but most people passed the sniff test. They made it through. They didn't have any obvious issues. And they were asked many, many times, like, do you know who this is? Do you know her? Do you know anyone in the court? It sounds like they're pretty buttoned up with possible jurors here. And at the end of the day, again, as you said, Andrea, we can't reveal who the jurors are unless they decide to reveal themselves after this trial is over. But I was able to glean some information being in the courtroom. It appears that those who were ultimately seated on the jury, it's 8 men and 8 women. And I was able to write down some of their professions just to give you a sense of maybe the age range. Here we had, a longtime veteran who has retired twice. He's older in age, to a college student. Plumber, a lot of people working in the healthcare space, different accountants, industrial electricians. So you have, all sorts of people. And that's essentially what a jury should be, a jury of your peers. That could be anyone and everyone who has no knowledge of the case and no biases that would impact their ability to serve on a jury. So it was an interesting breakdown, especially compared to how the last trial was. If you can remember that case, it was ultimately 2 women and then 10 men who deliberated in the case. And it was a male-heavy jury, which we thought could have been interesting for Lori-Vallow Daybell, who is accused of, being manipulative, especially when it comes to men.
Sure. Well, and I remember an attorney that I used to work with would remind people that when you say jury of your peers, oftentimes that means we think of peers as in people that we would hang out with or people in our age group. And it's really what that means is if you go to a grocery store, you go to your neighborhood community center, just turn around and anybody that you see there, that's a jury of your peers. Those are the people we're talking about. And they can, to your point, they can be of any age, any background, as long as there's not a reason to believe they're biased. Those, if they live in your community and they understand, those dynamics, they are your peers. And so it's, oftentimes we see that in jurors, quite a vast array of folks. And that's what the process is intended to do. And so we talked about those jurors from the last trial. And in fact, one of them was there today. Is that right?
That's right. Tosh Reed Tucker. And I interviewed them after the case was over. Again, this is a person who we met outside the courthouse. It was, you may remember if you've been following along with us, that as soon as the last case got out here in Arizona, the judge released the jurors from their admonition. They can do whatever they want, essentially, including talking to the media. And, as these jurors came out, we raced over to try and speak to them to say, hey, what did you know about, do you know her background? Do you know this? Can you believe this was the case you were on? And Tosh was very vocal. They were like, I can't believe this. It seemed like a bit of a shock to really realize the backstory. And they were in a situation where they hadn't lived in Arizona, moved here more recently. So it made sense that they didn't know the backstory, but they wanted to be there today. I was able to talk to them, before, during, after the proceedings, and, felt it important to see what it was like to be on the other side. And, as we closed out court this afternoon, the judge read these new jurors that admonition again, saying you can't talk to the media, you can't do this, you can't, do that. You have to be very, very careful. You are on this jury now. And he actually advised them as well that, these delays you can't take those into consideration or speculate as to why we may have been delayed. But, you know, from the vantage point of Tosh, who again went through a trial already, it was certainly an interesting experience to sit in on the other side. Take a listen.
It's still so crazy that this is happening, and on her being sick, it's interesting to see her talk normal to the jury, but then when they're not there, she can't talk, you know? So I don't want to like assume anything, but it's kind of there. Yeah. It's different being on the opposite side where we actually get to hear everything, as to where if you're on jury, they pull you out when you can't hear stuff. So it was completely different. I wanted to see what it was like on the other side. Being on the jury was pretty intense. So being on the stand side now, it's a lot different because it's not her eye. She's not looking at you at all times, and you're not having to focus so intensely. And as far as being coming back, as far as coming back, I'm gonna try to make it a couple more days. However, my job is like, why is it more important? But they don't understand. So, I'm gonna try to make it a couple more days for sure. The sentencing, though.
Well, they are not the first one that we have seen kind of take on, after sitting on a jury. We know that Tom Evans, the juror here in Idaho in Lori-Vallow Daybell's first trial, he's written a book about that. He sat through Chad Daybell's trial, her fifth husband, who is now, now on Idaho's death row. We know that this does happen. I mean, it's not that unusual for jurors. And I think that they speak to that exactly what Tosh just said, is that, you see it from one vantage point and you kind of want to get the rest of the picture. You kind of want to understand more about what goes on. What did you miss? And really, that's the only way to do it, is to be in the courtroom. And what a unique opportunity, because not every juror gets to do that, because we know that most defendants don't go on to have multiple trials, and even on the exact same charge. And so it is a unique opportunity, and it will be interesting to see if any of the other jurors come, like they said, for the big moments, the sentencing, the verdict, things like that. You'll have to keep an eye out for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And Tosh also indicated that, it was interesting to sit in there and be able to kind of express your reaction to what is happening in the courtroom. They told me, when we interviewed them after the verdict was read in the first case here in Arizona, they said that they had to be very, laser focused, and, you couldn't really react when you're sitting in that jury box. And it is different sitting, amongst us public members and media members, where you can't see Vallow Daybell's face at all times. But it's also interesting, Tosh pointed out, that you can sit in there during the sidebars and the moments where the jury's not in the room. And the judge did indicate that in his, remarks, the new jurors here were essentially given all of their instructions so they can go right into opening statements tomorrow morning. And, the judge said there will be moments where we have to talk without you in the courtroom. You are not to, take that in any sort of way. We just have to hammer things out sometimes. So, this is just how the court process works. And I think it's really fascinating for people who have been through a variety of different sides of it. And as we were talking to Tosh outside the courtroom today, the new wave of jurors, it's interesting because I don't think I've ever had a scenario where we're talking about this batch of jurors versus this batch of jurors. There were other reporters also talking with them, and the other jurors were coming out, and we said, okay, guys, we need to pause for a second because they're walking by. We don't want them to overhear anything. So we have a responsibility to be careful in what we're doing as well. So it's certainly an interesting set of circumstances, Andrea.
Yeah. So tomorrow we start the statement, so we're ready to go. It will also be interesting to see, just in terms of who today we saw who was there. It'll be interesting to see if the courtroom is as full. Do you get a sense that it won't be as well as well attended as her previous cases?
I think it's going to be well attended. Maybe not the exact same way, but we are already in a situation. And again, the possible jurors were taking up some of the courtroom today, but we had people turned away already.
Oh, wow.
who've
Okay.
been waiting. There were people that told me there are people I recognize from previous trials, not just here in Arizona, but in Idaho, who are here.
Yeah.
Waiting. Some people were out at 5 a.m. waiting to get in. We as the media have a bit of a different, we can, there's a different line for us to get in. There's some reserved media seats. So I may not have such an early wake up call every day, which is nice, but some people are dedicated to getting a seat in that courtroom and seeing how this all unfolds. Some people said, with the delay, I plan to be here Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, but now my flight is leaving. So I might miss some of the stuff that I thought I would get to see. So people are truly, planning their lives around this. But so yeah, we had a pretty full courtroom today. Unclear what may transpire as this goes on. And one person I'll point out, actually two, Andrea, who we haven't talked about to some degree, but Brandon Boudreaux, he's the alleged victim in this case. He's been in the courtroom all of these days, even as the delays were occurring and the possible jurors were turned away without any progress. He's been patiently waiting for this case to go forward. We know he's been supportive of some other people impacted by the case. He's had to testify in Idaho. So he was in the courtroom today. And then someone else who showed up that we were expecting to possibly see at some point throughout this trial is Kay Woodcock. She is J.J. Vallow's grandmother and Charles Vallow's sister. So she's also testified in every trial so far and has been deeply impacted by the crimes of Lori Vallow, her husband, Chad Daybell, and, as everyone says, Alex Cox, Lori's brother. So it's been interesting. And I go back to what Kay said after the verdict in Charles Vallow's case, that's Lori Vallow Daybell's former husband, who she's now been convicted of conspiring to kill. She said, we lost a lot of family members in this, but we gained a new family. And I think Kay and Brandon have been a support system for one another throughout all of this.
Sure.
And, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's also, interesting to note that we expect Brandon to testify here. We expect him to be the key witness. And so sometimes that comes into question about how is he allowed to be in the courtroom. I would assume that he will be allowed because he's also the victim in this case. And remember, victims, just as Kay was allowed to be in the courtroom during the Idaho trial because essentially a representative of the victim, JJ. And so that is an interesting thing. Just want to point out that's why that gets to happen. And so I would expect that both of them will be able to sit through the entire thing. At least Brandon will be able to because he is the victim.
Yes. And as far as we know, the witness list, at least the state put out, Kay Woodcock is not on it. So this will be the first trial we see where she maybe is not testifying or not speaking out as to what happened because, again, the narrow focus of this case, and as if we didn't say it before during our chat tonight, the jury cannot know about Lori Vallow Daybell's history. Right. It's going to be something that I would imagine they will eventually have the opportunity to look it up, but they've been advised not to do that at this point in time. And as I said, the judge gave some very strict orders as to, making sure they do nothing to really put them in a position to be excused or to impact the trial.
Right. Well, and that's exactly what we are going to be there. We're going to be listening, intently tomorrow to see as they lay out that case. We probably will get some clues during the opening statement about what we expect to see, who will be put on the stand, what they're going to be telling us, because that's the best part of opening statements. Really, it's the roadmap. It allows
Absolutely.
both sides to kind of set out exactly what they plan to do, and we will be there for that. Of course, we will take everyone inside the courtroom for that tomorrow morning. What time does court start tomorrow?
So we are expecting court to start at 10 a.m. local time. And this will be something that is streamed. You can watch it right here on Inside the Courtroom. We'll be sharing that with you. However, the stream is on a 30-minute broadcast delay. So it might not be exactly in real time. And I know for our stations here, Andrea, you at KTVB up in Idaho, me at 12 News here in Phoenix, I will be doing a live blog from Inside the Courtroom. So that will be, you can find that on our websites if people want to get that real, right down to the minute updates that are coming out of the courtroom. But it'll be really interesting. As you said, I agree. I'm excited for the opening statements. I think this is the case that maybe we have the least amount of details. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what the state lays out as a motive in this case, because we know, the motives for the Idaho cases, as well as her last trial here in Arizona, was she's doing everything to be with Chad Daybell. And, this might just not be, it might be a little different this time. So I'm curious to see that. And of course, Vallow Daybell, who's representing herself, we'll see what form she shows up in tomorrow. If she's still feeling sick, or so she says, she has to get up and put on her opening statement. So it'll be interesting to see what she has to say as well.
You would think that my dog, who is here inside the house, I'm enjoying the Idaho evening here, able to do this from home and talk to you. And it sounds like he's also very excited about tomorrow's opening statements. It sounds like he has something to say about that. So, well, I'll make sure that he tunes in and watches the stream.
Yeah, absolutely. And your dog is not alone. As I said, we are expecting people to be lining up early tomorrow, and we will certainly bring you the latest information and all, the inside scoop from inside the courtroom.
All right, we will see you tomorrow for that. And of course, we'll be back here to wrap it all up for you after court ends tomorrow evening. We hope to see you then.